For many decades, Africa's story was written with someone else's pen. Oil left its shores unrefined. Gold was taken away before it was purified. And what remained was silence, the silence of a continent waiting for permission to rise. But that silence is slowly ending. From the busy ports of Lagos to the red dust of Ouagadougou, a new rhythm is emerging. The rhythm of ownership. Nigeria is refining its own oil. Burkina Faso is refining its own gold. Two nations, two industries, one message. Africa will no longer sell its future at a discount. Even African News calls this the Great Awakening of the continent. And at the heart of this movement stands Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, who believes that freedom begins when we take control of our own resources. The question now is not, can Africa change? But rather, is the world ready for an Africa that believes in itself? For nearly half a century, Nigeria lived a paradox that most Americans could hardly imagine. It exported more crude oil than any other African nation, yet depended on imported gasoline to power its own cars and industries. The nation that fueled others could not fuel itself. That painful irony began to change in 2025. Under the leadership of billionaire industrialist Aliko Dangote, Nigeria inaugurated the Dangote Refinery, the largest single-train refinery ever built in Africa, and one of the most ambitious private energy projects in the world. According to African News, by August 2025, the refinery was already operating at 94% capacity, processing over 610,000 barrels of crude oil every single day. It now produces 327,000 barrels of gasoline, 244,000 barrels of diesel, and 56,000 barrels of jet fuel daily, along with nearly 300,000 tons of liquefied petroleum gas each year. But this is more than an industrial achievement. The refinery includes a 435 megawatt power plant and a 1,100-kilometer pipeline network, ensuring that both energy and wealth stay within Nigeria's borders. If fully optimized, this single complex could eliminate Nigeria's dependence on imported fuels, saving billions of dollars annually and creating tens of thousands of jobs. Dangote himself called it not just a business venture, but a statement that Africa can build, refine, and supply its own destiny. For the first time, Nigerians could fill their tanks with fuel produced from their own soil. It was a small act that carried the weight of national dignity. And as the first tankers carrying refined oil left Lagos, a symbolic echo spread across the continent, from Ghana to Burkina Faso, from Dakar to Nairobi. If Nigeria could reclaim its oil, perhaps others could reclaim their gold, their copper, their cobalt. But that was only the beginning, because while Nigeria refined its oil, another nation in the heart of the Sahel was about to turn raw gold into something far more powerful, a symbol of freedom itself. Deep in the Sahel, where red earth meets the endless horizon, lies Burkina Faso, a land whose greatest treasure has too often enriched everyone but itself. For decades, over 70% of its exports came from raw gold, dug by African hands, yet refined in foreign lands. The profit, the prestige, the final stamp of value, all of it vanished overseas. Then came a moment that changed everything. On November 23, 2023, under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, the government of Burkina Faso broke a century-old pattern. They announced the construction of the first national gold refinery in the country's history, right in the capital, Ouagadougou. According to African News, the refinery was expected to begin producing 22-carat bars within 11 months, with an annual capacity of 150 tons. And now, by October 2025, construction has entered its final stages. The refinery's first test batch of Burkina gold is set to roll out before the end of the year. More than a factory, it has become a declaration. Burkina Faso will no longer export its pride in unfinished form. The project has already created hundreds of direct and indirect jobs, secured hundreds of millions of dollars to remain within national borders, and most importantly, restored a sense of self-respect. For the miners who once watched trucks vanish into foreign hands, it means their labor will finally shine as Burkina gold. Not just anonymous bullion. President Ibrahim Traoré summed it up simply. We are not asking permission to be free, we are standing up to claim it. To many outside observers, that sounded defiant. To the people of Burkina Faso, it sounded like truth. This refinery has become a symbol, a golden fortress of sovereignty rising from the heart of the Sahel. And as history has shown, when a nation reclaims its wealth, it inevitably challenges the balance of power. Now, as October 2025 unfolds, the world, especially the West, is beginning to take notice. As Burkina Faso moved forward with its refinery, the world began to whisper. Western newspapers described Ibrahim Traoré as a populist soldier turned president and a young radical reshaping the Sahel. Financial analysts warned that nationalizing mines would scare off foreign investors. But in Ouagadougou, crowds filled the streets, waving the national flag, chanting, "Traoré, Traoré, the son of the people." In that chant was not defiance, it was faith. For the first time, Burkina citizens felt that their gold was theirs, not collateral in someone else's economy. African News reported that in 2024, government revenue from gold surpassed 8 tons, and by the first quarter of 2025, it had already exceeded 11 tons of refined bullion. To international markets, it was a small number. To Africa, it was proof that independence could be measured not in speeches, but in ounces. Western critics framed Ibrahim Traoré as a challenge to the old order, a man rejecting loans, advisors, and conditional aid. But inside Africa, his image grew into something larger, a symbol of dignified rebellion. He refused to play the role written for post-colonial nations, to export cheap and import expensive, to remain dependent forever. And so, a quiet storm began to form. Corporations questioned contracts. Diplomats requested explanations. The same powers that once applauded African development now frowned at African control. Yet, through the noise, the refinery walls continued to rise. The furnaces were installed. Security systems met the LBMA standards. The gold would stay and be purified on African soil. When asked if he feared isolation, Ibrahim Traoré smiled and said, "You cannot isolate a people who have found themselves." That sentence rippled far beyond Burkina Faso. It reached farmers in Mali, students in Ghana, and oil workers in Nigeria. It was no longer one country's revolution, it was an African awakening. But every awakening has aftershocks, and by October 2025, those tremors were already reaching Washington. When Burkina Faso lit its first refinery furnace, the glow spread far beyond the borders of the Sahel. Across the continent, leaders and citizens alike watched the news and whispered the same thought: if they can do it, so can we. In Nigeria, the story of Dangote's refinery now merged with Ibrahim Traoré's defiant vision. One nation refined oil, the other refined gold together, proving that industrial sovereignty was not a dream but a strategy. Soon, reports from African News began to sound like a drumbeat of progress. Ghana announced feasibility studies for domestic bauxite refining. Zambia expanded its copper smelting network. The Democratic Republic of Congo invited African tech partners to process cobalt for electric vehicle batteries rather than export raw ore. Each headline carried the same message: Africa's wealth will stay in Africa. For the first time in decades, conferences of African economists were filled not with talk of aid, but of engineering. Universities began adding programs in metallurgy, petrochemistry, and logistics disciplines once dominated by the West. Older generations, who had lived through cycles of coups and IMF austerity, found themselves daring to hope again. You could feel it in the markets of Accra, the ports of Mombasa, the radio stations of Dakar, a new language taking shape. No longer developing nations. Now they spoke of self-defining nations. And through it all, the name Ibrahim Traoré appeared again and again, not as a lone leader, but as a signal that the era of silent submission was closing. Yet history has never been kind to those who try to rewrite the rules, because every renaissance challenges someone's control, and the world's old powers was starting to pay attention. In Washington, the tone was cautious. At the Center for Strategic and International Studies, analysts describe the new wave, led by Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso, as a form of economic nationalism that could redefine Africa's global partnerships. Publicly, American officials congratulated African nations for pursuing self-reliance, but privately, in boardrooms and embassy cables, the conversation was less comfortable. If Africa refined its own gold, oil, and cobalt, global profit chains would shrink and leverage would shift. Refineries in Lagos and Ouagadougou meant fewer tankers heading to Houston and Rotterdam. Every barrel processed in Nigeria, every ingot cast in Burkina Faso was a statement: Africa no longer needs permission to prosper. Still, within the United States, not all saw this as a threat. Some writers, from the Atlantic to foreign policy, called it Africa's moral correction. They argued that what Ibrahim Traoré represented was not anti-Western, but pro-dignity, the same spirit that once drove America's own revolution for self-determination. One editorial in Africa News put it bluntly: the West speaks of democracy, but what is democracy without ownership? Ibrahim Traoré is not defying the world, he is reminding it of its own principles. Among American viewers, especially those old enough to remember the civil rights era, this message resonated deeply. They saw in Africa's awakening something familiar, the reclaiming of a narrative long denied. But power never yields quietly. Mining conglomerates lobbied for stability clauses. Financial institutions reconsidered credit ratings. Think tanks issued reports warning that resource nationalism could invite new tensions. And through it all, Burkina Faso stood firm. The refinery's construction continued, its furnaces gleaming under the Sahel sun, a symbol that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to finish what others said could not be done. By October 2025, the world was watching, and the question growing louder in Washington was this: if Africa can refine its own destiny, who will it need next? By late 2025, the rumble of change grew into a tremor the world could no longer ignore. In reports from Africa News, financial experts revealed that several Sahel nations, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, were quietly discussing the creation of a joint regional metals exchange, modeled after the gold refinery initiative led by Ibrahim Traoré. The idea was revolutionary: a unified platform where African nations could set their own metal prices, trade in regional currencies, and certify gold under African standards, no longer relying on London or New York to determine the value of their resources. To many, it sounded impossible. To Ibrahim Traoré, it was inevitable. "We cannot speak of independence if we still sell ourselves cheaply," he told Africa News during a visit to Ouagadougou's nearly completed refinery. If this alliance succeeded, it would mean the birth of the first African-controlled pricing mechanism for gold and rare metals, a development that could send shockwaves through international markets. For the first time since decolonization, Africa was not merely reacting to the global economy, it was shaping it. Investors called it the Burkina effect. Economists called it a paradigm shift. But on the streets of Lagos, Bamako, and Niamey, ordinary people called it what it truly was: justice. And just as the gold from Burkina Faso began to bear its national seal, a deeper transformation unfolded, not in numbers or markets, but in the hearts of its people. In a small mining town on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, where the Sahel wind rolls across endless plains of dust and red earth, a man named Amadou stood beside a gleaming gold bar, still warm, still radiant, freshly cast inside the nation's first refinery. His hands were rough, his fingernails rimmed with the memory of soil. Those hands had dug through rock for more than 30 years, often for wages so small he could barely feed his family. Yet today, his face held something unfamiliar pride. When a journalist from Africa News approached him, microphone trembling in the dry wind, Amadou didn't hesitate. He looked at the bar, then back at the camera, and said softly, "For the first time, my gold will not leave before it's worth something." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of generations of fathers and sons, of mothers who washed gold dust from riverbeds, of a people who had watched wealth leave their soil for centuries. Behind every refinery furnace, every government report, and every chart of economic growth, there were lives like Amadou's men and women who had given everything, yet received almost nothing in return. Now, for the first time, they could see the value of their labor before it disappeared into foreign hands. A few weeks later, the new refinery in Burkina Faso stood in full operation. The scent of metal and machinery mixed with the scent of possibility. When President Ibrahim Traoré arrived for his first visit, there was no red carpet, no grand announcement. He wore his usual brown fatigues and simple beret, the uniform of a soldier who still saw himself as one of the people. Instead of standing behind a podium, he walked the floor among the workers. He stopped to shake hands, to ask questions, to listen. Then one miner, a young man barely 20, stepped forward and placed a small gold nugget into his palm. The crowd fell silent. Traoré held it up, its surface catching the sunlight that poured through the open roof beams. "This," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "is not just gold. It is proof that Africa has remembered who she is." Applause erupted, not the polite applause of ceremony, but the roar of a people who had waited their entire lives to feel seen. Some wept openly, others knelt. Even the furnace operators paused, the fire behind them casting long shadows like ghosts of history finally laid to rest. In that single moment, Burkina Faso was no longer a struggling nation defined by poverty or instability. It was a mirror reflecting the soul of a continent, rediscovering its worth, a continent that had once supplied the world and now sought to supply itself. Across Africa, that image traveled faster than any headline. On Africa News, the footage replayed for days. Miners embracing, engineers cheering, the president's quiet smile as he returned the nugget to the young worker's hand. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a covenant. In Nigeria, refinery workers watched the broadcast and nodded in recognition. In Ghana, students studying metallurgy wrote essays about the Burkina example. In Mali, goldsmiths pledged to source their metal only from African refineries. From Nigeria's oil fields to the gold dust of the Sahel, a single message began to spread. Africa was no longer waiting for recognition. It was forging it ounce by ounce, barrel by barrel, heartbeat by heartbeat. And as night fell over Ouagadougou, the refinery's lights burned against the darkness like a constellation reborn. The glow reached farmers miles away, who said it looked like a second sunrise. Above it all, the Sahel wind whispered through the desert grass, carrying with it a quiet, almost sacred question, one that echoed far beyond Burkina Faso. If this is just the beginning, what will Africa create next? In the end, this is not only the story of oil or gold, it is the story of identity, of rediscovery, and of a continent daring to say the words it was once forbidden to speak aloud: "We are enough." For generations, Africa was told that its destiny depended on permission. Permission to trade, to build, to dream. But from the refineries of Lagos to the furnaces of Ouagadougou, a new truth is being written in fire and steel. It is the truth that true independence is not proclaimed with flags or anthems, but forged through work, knowledge, and the hands of those who refuse to surrender their worth. Every spark from a welder's torch, every thundering machine inside the Dangote refinery, every drop of molten gold in Burkina Faso's new foundries together, they speak louder than any speech. They say that Africa's freedom no longer needs validation. It is being built, engineered, and refined before the world's eyes. When African News aired its year-end feature on the new African Renaissance, the broadcast lasted nearly an hour. It showed factories, classrooms, laboratories, and new roads connecting once-forgotten towns. But among hundreds of images, one moment stood above all. President Ibrahim Traoré, walking beside the first bars of refined Burkinabe gold, his uniform simple, his step steady, his expression quiet, not triumphant, but deeply human. He smiled, not for the cameras, but for the miners, who now saw their labor turned into value within their own borders. He had no crown, no military parade, and no scripted applause, only conviction. "We did not ask for permission to be free," Traoré once said. "We stood up to claim it." That sentence has since become a quiet anthem across the continent. It is written on murals in Dakar, repeated in classrooms in Accra, and quoted in speeches from Nairobi to Kinshasa. It echoes in the workshop of an engineer training a young apprentice in Nigeria, in the steady heartbeat of a miner returning home to Burkina Faso, and in the dreams of a student opening a textbook in Addis Ababa, believing, for the first time, that the next century will not be defined by charity, but by creation. For older Americans watching from afar, this story feels strangely familiar. They see in it a reflection of their own origins, 13 struggling colonies, united not by wealth, but by a shared conviction that dignity and freedom are not gifts to be granted, but burdens to be carried with pride. The echo of that founding spirit now resounds on another continent, carried not by muskets and declarations, but by machines, tools, and education. Where America once fought for independence with ink and gunpowder, Africa is fighting for it with knowledge and self-belief. And in that symmetry lies something profound, a reminder that the pursuit of liberty is not owned by any nation. It is the natural rhythm of humanity itself. Today, in the markets of Accra, gold coins stamped with Burkina Faso Refinery circulate with pride. In Lagos, engineers wear badges that read, "Made in Africa." In Mali, children learn about Ibrahim Traoré not as a soldier, but as a teacher of courage. And across the Sahel, as the wind carries red dust across the desert, the people whisper, a phrase once used only in hope. This time, the story is ours. Africa's transformation is not loud, but it is unshakable. It is not about replacing the world, it is about reclaiming a voice long silenced. And perhaps that is why it feels so revolutionary, because power, real power, does not always shout. Sometimes it simply endures. So as dawn rises over the Sahel, the horizon glows gold, not from the metal itself, but from what it represents: belief, resilience, and rebirth. The question that now hangs in the air is both simple and historic. Will the world embrace an Africa that has found its voice? or fear the sound of its awakening. If the courage of Ibrahim Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso touches your heart, share this story. Let it reach every classroom, every newsroom, every place where Africa's story was once written by others. Subscribe to continue the journey of an Africa no longer on its knees, but standing, building, and believing. And may God bless Africa, the continent that finally remembered its worth and decided to live by it.